The year is 867. The Saxon kingdoms of Britannia are under siege. Enemies crowd around as the sons of Ragnar wreak havoc throughout the land. Raids and abductions are frequent. People fear the pagan menace and are beginning to lose faith in their god. The time has come for someone to take a stand and champion the Christian cause. This is the Crusader King's story of petty King James Bond, Lord of Cornwall. When James was only 8 years of age, he found himself in the protection of the Lord of Wessex, King Aethelbald. James, a noble himself, had inherited the lordship of Cornwall due to the untimely death of his parents. His father's council members, Melisande and Wulfgeat, consulted the Lord Aethelred about James's future. During his time in Wessex, James made an unlikely friend in the young Alfred, also 8 years of age. As James received tutelage in all things befitting a little lord, he soon began to show rowdy tendencies. He specifically took a liking to the art of subterfuge and warfare. While matters of administration, diplomacy, and learning bored him to no end. He spent days learning the ways of the shadow from his French spymaster, Melisande, or as he liked to call her, M for short. If he wasn't practicing his spying, he was out with his father's old Anglo-Saxon quartermaster, Wulfgeat, where he learned to utilize his physical talents in battle. He was growing into an arrogant and stubborn man of action, but also a devout man of God. Having spent much of his youth in Wessex, James developed an amazing sense of loyalty and patriotism to the land and the people, and believed wholeheartedly in the dream of uniting Cornwall, Wessex, and the other Christian kingdoms into one all-encompassing England. One thing, however, James could never quite control was his lust. He specifically utilized his skills at covert intelligence, schemes, and plots to seduce and play with as many young ladies' hearts as possible. Finally, at the age of 18, petty King James is ready to take his mantle as full-time Lord of Cornwall, but also as a hidden blade for Wessex. He will do all that he must and all that he can to defend what he and his friend dreamed would soon become the future Kingdom of England. The state, however, of the future Kingdom of England was not looking too bright, with pagan Vikings encroaching all around Saxon territories. Wars in Northumbria particularly scared the southern lords of Wessex, Mercia, and East Anglia. Now an adult and a lord at that, James set himself to the task of stopping the Viking menace. James set out into the northern lands in order to find the best target to hinder the progress of the heathing Viking horde. Having no major army of his own, however, James knew there was only one way that he would accomplish his goal of defeating the Vikings and helping form England, and that would be through the art of assassination. In his travels north, James, being the ever-opportunist, found some time to attempt to seduce some local women he met in towns and villages. The first girl that he took a fancy to was an intelligent French Catholic woman named Hildegard. As time went by, James soon discovered that Hildegard was more than she seemed. A nice, delicate French flower that hid the sharp thorns that lay beneath. Hildegard had sadistic tendencies, with a keen sense of vengeance, but James pushed forward, for all that mattered for the moment was her outer beauty. In the midst of courting Hildegard, James was sure not to forget his primary mission, the scouting of a good target to take down in the Viking leadership. Having tested many of the waters of other Viking leaders in the area, James deduced that Ivar the Boneless, Jarl of Sudreyar, would be the best target in order to cripple the Viking horde. So, he set out on a plot to assassinate the greatest Viking lord of all the Isles. Fortunately for James, Ivar was at war. This provided the perfect opportunity for James to slip into Ivar's ranks, gaining as much information as possible while dressed as a Northman. This helped James discover what times and places Ivar would be most vulnerable during this war. After months of scouting the hills and lands around Ivar's camp, infiltrating his ranks and gaining useful intel, James decided he would take a break and finally make his move on the French beauty Hildegard. That night, he devised a seduction plan in order to woo his way into her bed. And the best method he could come up with was to secretly climb up the outer fencing to her chambers and surprise her. As James slowly made his way up into her chambers, Hildegard was shocked and jumped backwards in a fright. She ran straight towards the door and shouted,
"Help! Guards! There's an intruder in my room!"
Feeling quite like the fool, James retreated back the way he came. After the failure of his seduction scheme, James needed to bounce back and decided to enact his plan to assassinate Ivar the Boneless tonight. Sneaking into his well-manned fort, James donned the Viking garb once more in order to blend in. Noticing that there was a feast nearby, James made it his business to poison the mead in order to lower the sensibilities of all those present. Having learned of Ivar's chamber's location from his earlier efforts, he knew exactly where and when to strike the so-called King of the Isles. Infiltrating in the middle of the night, James sunk the cold dagger into the boneless son of Ragnar, making it a night he would never forget. "I do love surprise visits," said James as he left the room. Feeling quite full of himself upon his successful assassination of the King of the Isles, James made for home, back south to Cornwall. But upon returning, James soon found out that there was trouble amiss. Cornwall wasn't exactly as peaceful as he had thought. His Marshal Wulfgeat soon informed him of Viking raiders, likely retaliating in a vicious rage after the death of their war leader, Ivar. They had landed on the western shores and had been pillaging and plundering their way to the capital of Exeter. James, exhausted from the long road back, ordered Wulfgeat to marshal the men. He went out and gathered what little levies, men-at-arms, and knights they had, and made their way to face the invaders. James commanded the armies himself. While not being the most experienced or trained commander, he was the best they had. The force of about 800 strong, 100 bowmen, 200 light footmen, and 600 peasant levies with 6 knights marched through the woods and hills towards Launceston, where word had reached their scouts that the Vikings were currently weaving through the settlement. Upon reaching the settlement, the Cornish scouts report the Viking numbers to be less than their number. This made James bullish. Instead of possibly waiting for a better battle opportunity, he immediately commanded the forces to move into the burning town and engage the enemy.